The reading today is from Malachi, chapter 4. See, the day is coming, burning like an oven, when all the arrogant and all evildoers will be stubbled. The day that comes shall burn them up, says the Lord of hosts, so that it will leave them neither root nor branch. But for you who revere my name, the Son of Righteousness shall rise, with healing in its wings. You shall go out leaping like calves from the stall. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
The Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, O Lord.
When some were speaking about the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and gifts dedicated to God, Jesus said, "As for these things that you see, the days will come when not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down." They asked him, "Teacher, when will this be, and what will be the sign that this is about to take place?" And he said, "Beware that you are not led astray, for many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and 'the time is near.' Do not go after them. When you hear of wars and insurrections, do not be terrified. For these things must take place first, but the end will not follow immediately." Then he said to them, "Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, and in various places famines and plagues, and there will be dreadful portents and great signs from heaven. But before all this occurs, they will arrest you and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors because of my name. This will give you an opportunity to testify. So make up your minds not to prepare your defense in advance, for I will give you words and a wisdom that none of your opponents will be able to withstand or contradict. You will be betrayed, even by parents and brothers, by relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. You will be hated by all because of my name, but not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance, you will gain your souls." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
I couldn't resist the picture on our bulletin cover when our media coordinator showed it to me last week. If that doesn't make you smile, you might be the Grinch. Several years ago, I was out for a walk in the mountains when I unexpectedly came upon a pasture of cows. It was apparently the birthing season, as there were quite a few calves in the herd. And most of them were doing what the one on your bulletin is doing, leaping and dancing with unbridled joy. I just sat down right there and enjoyed the show. I've never seen anything quite like it. You don't have to have very much experience with cows to see why leaping calves was such a rich metaphor when Malachi used it. You also don't have to have much experience with the seasons of the church to know that we are nearing the end of another church year. Since the church year always begins with Advent, and the anticipation of the coming of Jesus, both in Christmas and in the future second coming, the church year always ends by talking about the end things, judgment and salvation, and the crowning of Jesus as King. For the Old Testament prophets like Malachi, the coming of the day of the Lord was a certainty. The world was a messy place. Some people believed in God, and some did not. Some tried to live in relationship with God, and some lived as enemies of God. The prophets expected God to literally step into the world and human history and save the faithful and destroy the enemies and reign forever. It was a good news, bad news proclamation. Good news for the Israelites, bad news for their enemies. Eventually, ideas about the day of the Lord got rather bleak for everyone, though. Even the faithful people didn't always follow the righteous ways of the Lord. If salvation depended on anyone's perpetual personal righteousness, who stood a chance? So the coming day of the Lord carried a threat that you should shape up or else. You should stand firm and do justice and righteousness, or beware, God was going to get you. When you are waiting for God to do something, like literally step into the world and human history and set the world in order, and then centuries pass, and then millennia pass, and nothing really changes, it is hard to keep hoping. That was true for the Israelites Malachi spoke to several centuries before Jesus was born. That was true for the disciples Jesus spoke to. And that can certainly be true for us. For the Israelites whom Malachi spoke to, their waiting and hoping had ultimately included a Messiah, someone anointed by God to establish God's rule forever. Malachi's charge to the Israelites was to remain faithful to and revere God and keep the commandments given to Moses until then. Malachi quotes God as the very last words of our Old Testament, saying, "Lo, I will send you the prophet Elijah before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes. He will turn the hearts of parents to their children and the hearts of children to their parents, so that I will not come and strike the land with a curse." Christians have always interpreted that word to point to John the Baptist, the prophet who prepared the way for Jesus. We'll talk more about him next month in the new church year in the season of Advent. For the disciples whom Jesus spoke to, their hope of a Messiah had been realized. They believed that Jesus was God's Messiah, the one anointed by God to establish God's rule forever. Jesus still talked about the day of the Lord, the day when God would save the faithful and destroy God's enemies and reign forever. But Jesus presented a significant change in the conversation. If salvation depended on anyone's personal righteousness, indeed no one stood a chance. But Jesus wanted to give salvation to everyone who believed he could. Believing that created some very real dangers, though. Jesus warned his followers that believing he was the Messiah would be dangerous. The enemies of God were still out there trying to stop Jesus' message, still trying to establish their own power against God's power. So the disciples of Jesus would be arrested and persecuted and handed over to synagogues and prisons and brought before kings and governors. They would be betrayed by relatives and friends and hated, and some even put to death. They would have to endure. And a lot of other bad things would still occur before the final day of the Lord. Wars and earthquakes and famines and plagues and such. We are still waiting for the day of the Lord and still called to hope and to endure, even when we don't see anything changing. Even when terrible things still happen in the world, even when people try to establish their own power over God's power, God will one day establish God's reign forever. The good news of Jesus is that we don't have to hear that as a threat. Oh, I do think God has very high expectations of us. And I do think that we will each have to give an account of our lives to God and be judged. But I also believe that Jesus wants to give us salvation. On our own, we don't stand a chance of being completely righteous before God, but Jesus is. And Jesus' righteousness is enough. We are still called to keep the commandments of God, though, regardless of what is happening in the world around us, especially those commandments highlighted by Jesus about loving God and loving our neighbors. We are still called to follow and work for God's ways of justice and mercy. And doing that can still be a personally risky and maybe even dangerous thing. But we don't do those things because we are terrified of God's judgment or uncertain of our salvation. God's judgment will be merciful, and our salvation will be a certainty. We endure. We hope. We love God. We love our neighbors. We work for justice and mercy, and we revere God because one day the Son of Righteousness shall rise with healing in its wings, and we will find ourselves leaping like calves from the stall. And that's a picture you just can't resist. Amen.